Let me say that I'm not one of those who was under any illusions that Mr. Odinga would win. I was clear in my mind that he would lose. And I travel across this continent quite a bit. And what amazed me is that the Raila camp and Kenya by extension assumed that when presidents accorded him the courtesy of meeting them, that amounted to support. This was courtesy. And I can tell you one or two friends who are heads of state who he said were his supporters said, no, we are affording the man courtesy. And that in itself is indicative of how, as a country, our diplomacy is weak. And this is not the first time that Kenya has found herself in this space. Remember, several years ago, we had Amina Mohammed contesting with Muhammad Faki. And we did almost the same thing. And I'm on record as writing to all heads of state.
Yes.
And telling them, postpone this election, implement the Kagame reforms, have a caretaker task force, and then we can go into elections. I'm also on record as saying publicly that the style that was being employed by Raila Odinga for campaign was not right. This is head of a secretariat, and yet they were marketing it to the Kenyan population that Raila was going to be the president of presidents.
Yes, the president.
It is
of
only
Africa.
yesterday that one of the newspapers now said the CEO of the African Union after Mr. Odinga had lost the election. So I think that we made a mistake. And the mistake that was made, number one, was that you fielded a candidate who was not the best candidate. When you are 80 years of age, and I've said this times without number, you don't seek an office of that kind. This is a CEO's office, which entails a lot of travel, entails a lot of sitting in meetings, fundraising and all. At 80, you ought to retire. Mwalimu Nyerere of Tanzania once said, when he was 63 and he left office, lazima tujue kung'atuka. You must know when to leave the office. But the president of the Republic of Kenya saw this as an opportunity effectively to exile Mr. Odinga. Exile him so that he could inherit his political constituency. And you saw how Raila's primary constituency, which is the Luo of Kenya, went gaga when Raila was nominated. Ruto suddenly became a saint, a canonized saint who could do no wrong. And the net effect is that you made Mr. Odinga run round the continent, spent billions of shillings, and this is what has ended up. And to hear people saying that if you voted somebody else other than Mr. Odinga, then that is a justification for the split of the continent of Africa, is juvenile at the very best. Juvenile because if, as is said, you want to create a democratic environment, then you ought to expect to win. I'm glad that Mr. Odinga himself has conceded defeat, so I don't want to listen to his supporters who don't understand the dynamics. I'm glad that the president of the Republic of Kenya has also accepted that the process was properly conducted. So at that level, I don't fault both the Kenyan candidate and the Kenyan president and the Kenyan delegation for conceding defeat. But I was in Addis Ababa on the 11th and 12th, and I knew that the last nail on the coffin had just been drilled in. The conduct of Kenyans, they are singing outside of the headquarters of the African Union, Tawala Africa, Tawala.
Kenya kipenzi chetu.
How can you do that? Conversely, the two candidates, one from Madagascar, who was a foreign minister, was dignified in the manner in which he conducted himself. The current chair of ACE, the newly elected Yusuf, was dignified. But you send large delegations of people who are doing nothing, cantankerous to the hilt, and the net effect is that we see what we have seen. And really, I think that we as a country must re-examine ourselves. If I was the president of the Republic of Kenya, my first act would be to remove my Minister for Foreign Affairs. And everybody who was involved, because the diplomatic faux pas that was being committed at all levels during the run-up to these elections is without comparison.
Prof, if I can jump in and ask you that, because academics, I mean, we saw this from different, quick publications that were done, even over the weekend and the run-up to, questioned then the state and the practice of Kenya's foreign policy when it comes to things like this. Like you say, by then it's possible that it was a fait accompli where, like you say, the nail was drilled into the coffin.
Stop met sparen terwijl je leven achteruit gaat. Er is een betere.
But what does that say for how then Kenya conducts itself with other nations, and what can actually be done to ensure that you have a proper flowing of this, diplomatic relations, implementation and enactment of foreign policy? Because here we are, and it looks as though, like you said, we still have a few, rungs to climb up in terms of growth.
If you look, and let's give this a historical context, we have always been diplomatically weak. There was only at one instance, not at two instances, when we had Munyo Wayaki as the Minister for Foreign Affairs in this country and Robert Ouko.
Right.
There was clarity. When they spoke about something, when they articulated Kenya's position, you saw that there was some kind of attempt to orient Kenya's diplomacy in some direction. We now say that our diplomacy is designed towards economy and trade, but you don't see it articulated. In the region, you've seen in the East African community, when we have taken positions as the East African community, then we go out unilaterally to engage with other countries. We have engaged unilaterally with the United States on critical issues against the grain. We have engaged unilaterally with the European Union. Only recently you saw the president, instead of engaging Cyril Ramaphosa on the DRC, says, I've engaged Macron.
Yeah.
Who wants to engage with Macron?
On African matters.
On African matters. So we have to re-examine ourselves. There was an attempt, let me say this, when Rafael Tuju was the Minister for Foreign Affairs, there was an attempt by him to try and articulate things in a proper manner. But as it is now, I hope that the Kenyan delegation will come back and they will re-examine the manner in which we conduct our affairs. And there's been no shortage of commentators and bloggers. Some, of course, at the behest of the government, some at the behest of the candidate, saying all manner of things. But when all is said and done, we must ask ourselves the question, are we good East Africans? Are we good Africans? Are we good for Africa? When you now say that it is Africa's loss, when members of parliament are saying that one of the things we are going to do is to ask East Africa to withdraw from the African Union because our candidate has lost, how do you communicate? Do you have a country that has proper communication? Do you have men and women who think, men and women who love this country and by extension this region and this continent? And on the basis of the evidence that I've seen, we have individuals whose only claim to fame is that they cannot be accused of being intelligent.
Interesting, because I was actually very interested to understand your perspective, because there are many other things that would shape the race. It was actually out in the open. The geopolitics, the language and religion aspects of the AU member states, other factors likely to come into play as analysis came prior was the age of the candidate, which you've spoken on. You see the Anglophone and the Francophone divide, the Western influence and emerging forces in the globe like Russia and China. Now, speaking of how Kenyan conducted itself, leave alone the candidate we fronted, the analysis of the divide, you're speaking of one Africa, but if Kenya was to be genuine all right, and look at all these things in perspective, do you think then would have stood a chance to get this AUC chair position? And I want you to really measure on the geopolitics of the African Union states. Did it come into play? The aspect of, Djibouti's candidate speaking numerous languages. He was actually still serving as foreign affairs minister at the time. What would you say on the factors that came into play in what we saw as Djibouti taking over the chairmanship?
Let us look at the structure of the African Union. Number one, we know that the position of the AU position commission chair is rotational and is deliberate so that each region has the opportunity to serve. When Nkosazana and Lamini Zuma served, she was, if you want to use these colonial terms, from Anglophone. She was from South Africa.
Yep. When
Jean Ping served, he was this idea of Muslim. He was Christian. Lamini was also Christian. And Jean Ping was serving from Central Africa. When Konare served, he served from West Africa. And when Amina and Mahamat served at that time before the rotation came in, he was from Chad. So if you wanted to fill the candidate, and there was no shortage of candidates, look at somebody who had served as the AUC vice chair like Erastus Mwencha.
Right.
Why don't you fill the Mwencha if you want to have somebody who has experience? And if you want to be in that space, you have an advantage if you are speaking multiple languages, working languages of the union. And we must also go back and remember that even before the AU, we had people like Salim Ahmed Salim of Tanzania. We had people like Etem Kojo. So this argument that is now coming after the event, that if you can't reach a fruit, you say it is not ripe enough, is without merit. But that notwithstanding, I hold the view that we need to reform the African Union and her institutions. And once we do that, it is important that we as a country and we as a region also organize ourselves. Look at the manner in which we did it. If we had wanted to field a Kenyan candidate, what would have been easier than for the President of the Republic of Kenya to convene a meeting without the razzmatazz that we saw, bring in everybody and said, please, Kenya had an opportunity to field a candidate before. This is a time when allow us to field one candidate. Our candidate would have been a shoe-in candidate. But you hire individuals who are insulting Djibouti. Insulting Djibouti on a daily basis, saying this is a little country which is a lucky of France, which is the home of many military bases. People hired by, I don't know whether it's the candidate or the country. So all those issues come into play. But when you are good, you are good. It doesn't matter whether you are Muslim or Christian. Nkosazana was not a Muslim. Jean Ping is half Chinese, was not a Muslim. He was just good. And the reality is, let us accept that we conducted a poor campaign. Let us accept that our candidate did not fit the bill. Let us accept that we goofed. And once we do that, we must come home and ask ourselves, in the next phase, how are we going to engage the continent of Africa? And how are we going to conduct ourselves when we are dealing with the continent of Africa? And let me say something.
Yes.
You know, this abduction that we talk about, you have Kizza Besigye of Uganda abducted from this country. And you have had several high-level Nnamdi Kanu from Nigeria abducted from this environment. And as somebody has already said, you have heads of state who themselves have been victims of such conduct, like Faye in Senegal, Hakainde Hichilema, Boko Duma, all these individuals who have been victims of human rights abuse. And you expect them to vote for a candidate who throughout the campaign did not condemn any of these activities, a candidate who throughout the campaign did not talk about any of the conflicts in Africa, because he was playing safe.
How far-reaching do you think that ignorance of the necessity to make known such condemnation? How far-reaching do you think that would be?
And maybe to add, because we saw Ruto, walk along with Raila Odinga, and at some time he spoke more than Raila did. And do you think then that if Ruto did speak on some of these issues, maybe at home, it would be a representation of just not the candidate speaking directly, but Ruto was a representation of Kenya speaking at the time?
Let's look at all the candidates. At no time did you see the Djibouti president walk with the Djibouti candidate. He was a candidate.
Welcome to the new location of World Workplace Europe.
But
Ruto was a representation of Kenya speaking at the time.
Let's look at all the candidates. At no time did you see the Djibouti president walk with the Djibouti candidate. He was a candidate in his own right. On the part of our candidate, it was obvious that he was a candidate of the president. And it was obvious to everybody who wanted to know that this was being done for purposes of domestic politics. When you do that, then you are bearing the burden of a president who, in truth, is now held in suspicion by quite a number of his colleagues because of the manner in which he has conducted himself. So that burden is borne by the Kenyan candidate, and he fell under the weight of those diplomatic missteps by the head of state.
Let me ask the question. The many tenets that one could argue represent the structure that you need when referring to foreign diplomacy. One of them is building trust in relationships. As a country, have we actually endeavored to do that with our neighbors?
If you ask me, we have not.
Yes.
And there is no shortage of examples. Look at the situation when we were asked to intervene in the situation in Sudan. The Sudanese rejected our Kenyan president as being the leader of that process on the ground that he had met the opposition leader, Hemeti. You will remember that in the region, we have not played a very safe game when we are dealing with Uganda or Rwanda on different occasions, not necessarily during this administration.
Don't forget DRC.
Remember DRC. And remember also this, our candidate himself at one time was rejected in La Côte d'Ivoire when he was proposed to be a mediator. So there is a sense in which our diplomacy has lacked maturity. And the net effect is that we are held in suspicion, even by countries such as Tanzania, who normally like to be nice to everybody. So when you look at the environment, we are a country under suspicion. And because we are under suspicion, we are not treated in the manner that we ought to be treated if we were consistent in the manner that we conducted ourselves. And it is a time for examination as a continent and a time for examination as a country. How are we going to relate with others? I've already indicated how within the East African community, we had agreed that we would do certain things jointly. Then unilaterally, we became America's poster boy during the Biden administration. And we lost it. Hubris came in. And when you have hubris, nemesis normally comes.
Normally follows. Professor P.L. Lumumba is our guest this hour, and we're looking at, all right, the events leading towards and those after the election of the new AUC chairperson and other elections that took place. So what does it mean? How should Kenya conduct itself moving forward as it relates to African matters? Can you have an African Union when you have fractured pieces that essentially should come together to form the whole piece? And I guess one of the questions that arises, Prof, from one of the things that you said is, all right, so you had a bump in the road, no matter what it is. If Kenya wants to look at it as a bump in the road in terms of how it's going to relate with the rest of Africa moving forward and how it's going to continue to stamp its sovereignty in this region, what would be the ways? I mean, we often lament and we pontificate quite often without going towards solutions and saying, okay, so how are we going to be part? How is Kenya going to be part of this, union, this supposed unity? If we hear some of the sentiments that we hear so loudly over the last couple of days.
I think Kenya is an important African country.
Yes.
And one of the things that we must do is to have a thorough assessment of how we conducted ourselves during these campaigns and how we conducted ourselves in Addis Ababa and what message we sent. And once we have done that, we must shun what I call the Nairobi mentality. You remember when the East African Community One collapsed, one of the reasons was described as the Nairobi mentality. The assumption by Kenyan political leadership that we are better than everybody else. And that was essentially because we were lackeys of the neo-colonialists, initially of the British, and of course, during this administration for a short while, lackeys of the Americans, including being a NATO ally, a non-member NATO ally. So what must we do? The President of the Republic of Kenya happens to be the chair of the East African Community. Let us demonstrate that we are a country that is moving with everybody else. And as he is the chair of the East African Community, there are pending applications of new members. Ethiopia is one such applicant. Djibouti is one such applicant. So I think there is need for what one may describe as rapprochement. And this will require, among other things, that we work very closely with institutions of the African Union. Once we strengthen the East African Community, then we've got to strengthen the regional community. And I'm very happy, for example, that during the Dar es Salaam meeting, when we had SADC and East African Community, we agreed that the problem of the Democratic Republic of Congo will now be described as the Luanda-Nairobi process. That gives Kenya an opportunity to demonstrate that she can be a player in the African continent. Number two, because we want to reform African institutions, it is important that we participate in that process. And when we are nominating individuals in those spaces, we must nominate individuals who have the wherewithal. Today, if you ask many Kenyans who is the Kenyan representative to the Pan-African Parliament in Midrand, South Africa, Kenyans do not know.
No, here, absolutely.
If you ask Kenyans who is the judge who was appointed recently to the East African Court of Justice, who has been rejected by the courts, Kenyans do not know. It is important that we go into that space and change the manner in which we run our diplomacy. If we do that without lamentation and learn from this experience, then Kenya will be the richer. We are Kenyans, and a good Kenya is good for East Africa and good for the continent of Africa. And that is what many of us desire, a good Kenya, which respects her neighbors, and respects other people. When I hear the kind of talk that is emanating from some of the political class, it is important that their leaders call them to order and to tell them, shut up. And I hope they will.
Prof, I want to bring up something. I think you're the one who quoted this. So I'm quoting you, and I wanted to talk to it because you have mentioned some sort of, and I'm probably just trying to paraphrase, attitudes that could put Kenya in a place and they have to recheck. And you said the third world is a state of the mind. And until we change our attitude as Africans, if there is a fourth, fifth and sixth world, we will be in it. And I want you to speak on this today. I know you quoted it some time back, but third world is a state of the mind. And looking at the fourth, fifth, sixth, that would be way lower than third world. So how do we learn from this quote you gave years back to today to get better?
And I can perhaps render even yet another quote from Malcolm X. Malcolm X said that once you've been made to use the back door for too long, Even when the front door is open, you will look for a back door. And if you can't get one, you'll create one. In other words, we must change our minds. And when people talk about decolonizing the mind, it means that we've got to have confidence in ourselves. And that is the problem with Africa. If you look at African institutions, the AU is actually over 70% funded by outsiders.
Right.
Absolutely.
If you look at the African Development Bank as I speak now, after Nigeria, the second largest shareholder is the United States of America. There is Germany, there is Japan, so that even African institutions are being taken over. And I hold the view that the time to do this is to have confidence in ourselves. Look at Kenya. Our GDP, give or take, if GDP is a good measure at all, is no more than 120 billion United States dollars. That is Mickey Mouse. If we were to work properly, we would increase our GDP, and that requires that things such as the Africa Continental Free Trade Area work. It requires that we allow movement of goods, tariff and non-tariff barriers in East Africa. Do that, then suddenly we have a market in East Africa only of nearly 300 million people. I am therefore saying that the time is now to have confidence in ourselves, to believe in ourselves. Has it been done before? Yes, look at the Southeast Asia. Look at Vietnam today. Look at Indonesia today. Look at South Korea today.
Right.
Look at China today. Look at Laos and Cambodia. And look even at Bangladesh. And look at what happened to our EPZ here. We are killing our EPZ, that which was a hub. So in a nutshell, one is saying the mind is the standard of the man. And if we have positive attitudes and people are judged by the content of their character and their mind, not by their ethnic extraction.
Right.
You know, Nyerere used to say, katika karne ya 21 mnapanda basi ya makabila. Kenyans must shun this ethnic thing where people are appointed on the basis of technical know-who rather than technical know-how.
So this is interesting as you say this, Prof, because I believe it was on Friday, we had a conversation with Honorable Abino Obung, and we talked about the fact that if we're really going to talk about African unity, the tenets upon which the original idea of African unity was built was that you cannot have African unity if the units do not have their house in order. So can we come forward and say that we're going to form part of this larger body, which was to ensure that certain things happen, the things you talk about, that trade barriers will fall, that currency will be able to move from Nairobi to Accra and, you know, from Jamena to Pretoria, that could happen, that people would be able to move from one place to another, that you would be able to have lower travel, and that people can do business with ease, and that nations can develop within their own sovereignty, but at the same time come together and not compete with one another, but build towards one another. That was the idea around, you know, the OAU. That was the idea in the very beginning. Can you do that if the units are fraught with conflict? The units are fraught with poor leadership and bad governance. The units are fraught with underdevelopment and ailing economies. Can we do that?
You can't. And let's just examine what is happening in Becuase, for example. They argue that because Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali had military coups, I call them extraordinary change of power because the circumstances necessitated, and they are very popular. Then they threatened those countries and they did not even participate at the AU.
They were sanctioned,
And they have created their own Sahelian region. So it is important, and I can't agree with you more. Make ECOWAS strong. Make SADC strong. Make East African community strong. Make Central Africa strong. Make the Maghreb strong, because these are the building stones. Once you have the building stones which are strong, then you can weld the continent together. And the continent has made to herself very many promises. Last year only, we had about 3 major meetings on agriculture. We have had since 1980 the Yamoussoukro Agreement on free airspace. We have had the Abuja Declaration on Health that we are going to spend 15% on health.
Yeah.
We have had this Malabo Declaration on unconstitutional changes of government. There is everything that needs to be said has been said, and the time is for implementation. So in order to drill down my answer, I'm simply saying it is important that the Rex go back home and begin to clean their backyard. Look at South Africa now. We have the insurgency in northern Mozambique. How are we dealing with it? How are we dealing with the situation within the Democratic Republic of Congo? Within ECOWAS, how are we dealing with the situation in southern Cameroon? Within the Maghreb, how are we dealing with the situation in Libya and the insurgencies in northern Mali, northern Burkina Faso, northern Chad, and those areas? And within East Africa, how are we dealing with the situation, the largest East Africa, dealing with the situation in Sudan, in South Sudan, the emerging insurgency in Djibouti?
Right.
How are we dealing with the Somali situation? Once we address all those issues, and I know that the theme for African Union this year was reparation,
Right.
but when your house is on fire, you don't go look for your debts. You put the fire out. So the first priority of the AU of João Lourenço as chairman and Yusuf Mohammed should be peace and security. Because from peace and security, all these things will flow. Then you'll talk of agriculture, you'll talk health, you'll talk education, you'll talk trade. And this can only happen if parts of the body are healed.
Indeed.
You know, if you look at the anatomy of what we refer to as, we call it extraordinary measures and extraordinary alignments, coups, military coups. The question as to why they come about is clear. Because when you live in a country, beyond just seeking power, and you can see the never-ending cycle of poverty, and it never seems to move, and it's decades on. Some people feel, you know, something must be done. You look at Ghana and its stability.
Right.
How many times did Rawlings have to overthrow the government of his country for it to get to the point where they realized? See, now we are fortunate, far more fortunate than many of our kith and kin on the continent. We have a constitution that makes the citizen the sovereign. But are we willing to take our rightful position and offer the oversight that starts with whether it's an MCA to the member of parliament, to the senator, and then to the president? Because there are always complaints about what the political leadership does. And I find that particular complaint tiresome because it's like you're saying, there's nothing I can do.
Yes.
And it's not true. It's not true. If you have political leadership who have chosen the birthright that we gave them by electing them, if they've sold it to the executive, surely, should we not do something about it? Because it was ours. We gave it to them. So let me ask the question.
Right.
It amounts to a poverty of spirit that we've had on the continent. Citizens of this continent have been browbeaten by the colonialists. Then the leadership they've had have continued in that same trend. Are we in a position, used to ask this question, where we can say, you know, folks, we really do need to be patriotic and take our lives into our own hands. We need to make decisions that benefit us, not decisions that somebody else is making. But are we in a position to do that?
I think there is emerging consciousness across the continent. People are making demands so that the lethargy rise many African nations is beginning. I think there is emerging consciousness across the continent. People are making demands so that the lethargy that characterize many African nations is beginning to disappear. And let us look at it at different levels, that in certain countries, you see that the political class have perfected the art of manipulating political processes. And that is how our young men and women in the military in a number of countries then come in and say, we are going beyond our ordinary call of duty because the ordinary processes have been manipulated and made useless, and we are intervening only for a short while for purposes of stabilizing the environment. And remember, Kwame actually in 1961 made this statement. He said that the military does not have any business with politics, but if it becomes necessary, they can intervene, but only for a short time. So that consciousness, I think, is critical. But I hear you to be saying, what about at the civilian level?
Yes.
At the civilian level, we have a duty. And the beauty in Kenya, and this is one of the things that makes me happy to be a Kenyan, is that Kenyans are always agitating. They are using the methods that are available. If it is the courts, they are going to courts. If it is agitation, if it is through forums such as this, we irritate leadership into action. And our duty is to irritate them, so that they know that they will not be at peace. And I believe that if we do that often enough, then we create courage, start recalling MPs, start recalling senators, and we are doing a good job in that regard. Is it happening in different parts of Africa? Yes, it is beginning to happen.
So, I mean,
Right,
you mentioned something in that, sorry, just as you, at the very beginning of this conversation, that when we look at the candidacy of Raila Odinga being put for the AUC, being put forth as the AUC chair, that what that would have done is that would have put him away from the Kenyan political scene, because we know what has been that previously he was a political thorn in the side to the administration in terms of pushing for certain agenda. The speculation is rife that now that he will not be in that position, that he would come back to Kenya and resume his duties as said political thorn in the side of the administration. We've seen the handshakes, we've seen the camaraderie between, the president and himself, putting some of his, putting in some of his, his generals in positions. Do you see that this would have any kind of shift on the internal policy of politics?
I pray and hope that Mr. Odinga will not listen to his immediate circle, that he does not get into Kenyan politics at 80. Let me repeat, at 80 years of age, it is his time now to reflect, to be on the speaking circuit. If he has a foundation, it is his time now to do what the late Sam Nujoma did. Went to the farm, and what Mandela did, went to the farm and said, don't call me unless I call you. When he does that, he will be respected. Let him write his final book. If he did that, but if he is persuaded by his political hangers-on, who will tell him we are going to be orphans and who want to use his name to come to parliament, to go to Senate or to be governors, he will be embarrassed. He will be embarrassed. Of course, his base constituency will always be with him.
All right.
But his value in the political mortgage market is thoroughly compromised. Of course, the president, given the nature of our ethnic politics, will want to tango with him. But this is the time for Kenya to re-examine. I was intimately involved in the process of constitution making. And one of the things that we did was to say that we wanted to create political parties which were of national character. Unfortunately, that has failed. Political parties still are ethnic outfits, and people move from political parties with ease. If you look at any one of the political players, each one of them has been in political parties of formations not less than 10 in the last 20 years. Mr. Odinga has been in nearly 12 political formation. Mr. Kalonzo has been in nearly 6. The president himself has been nearly in 7 or more. You cannot have that. Go to our neighbor and you see a political party, Chama cha Mapinduzi, or the opposition, Chama cha Demokrasia, or SCTR Mageuzi. Those are political parties. When will we change? When will we stop singing the ethnic thing? Look at the former deputy President of the Republic of Kenya, who was impeached and convicted. We never say that. He was convicted upon trial, although I didn't support the process that led to his impeachment.
All right.
In other parts of the world, he would not be running around talking.
Okay.
He would actually be very quiet and he would be reflecting. But he is pontificating around the country and meeting people at his rural home. So we must introduce what I've called in a book, something I've called it in 2 books. One is Sanitizing Kenyan Politics, and one is a call for political hygiene. We need hygiene, for this generation and generations yet to be born.
All right.
Unfortunately, these bad habits are being transmitted to younger politicians who are even more cantankerous. I do not know what we are going to do, but I'm not helpless. I think we must now begin to organize and reorient our politics.
Indeed.
And I'm just looking at this. Our country must morally rearm. Yes. We cannot run a country where virtue is vice and vice is virtue. We cannot live in a country where the looters of yesteryears assume they have undergone a Pauline conversion because they are in opposition and oppose the government of the day. Some of our richest men and women are to be found in politics, and their creed is, "Thou shalt reap what thou hast not sown." It's very interesting when you said this, because what I'm looking at is this Pauline conversion. What is that?
Paul on his way to Damascus was Saul. And he met the Lord, so he tells us, and he became Paul. So you have these individuals, and many of them, I know them. I remember when I was the CEO of the Kenya Anti-Corruption Commission, and one of the reasons why they changed the law to abolish my office is because I wrote a letter to the then Speaker of the National Assembly, Mr. Marende, and I said, I want all the wealth declaration forms of all members of parliament and all civil servants. I never received any response.
Okay. Wonder why.
To date, of course, nobody wants that. And the reality is that these individuals, somebody is a thief today and is known, and yet we appoint him into some office.
Right.
Somebody is a thief and we receive him in church and we accept his money. I am glad the Catholic Church is now rejecting that money. The reality is that we must ask ourselves, who do we put in public office? If you have stolen 1 million and we make you a governor, and within 1 month you are now buying houses and cars and you are flying to Dubai, you are a thief. In fact, a friend of mine told me we should not use the word corruption.
Or mismanagement of resources.
No, just say thieves on an industrial scale.
Right.
And when we seize your property, we say, X, this is the property that was owned by X, who was a thief. So that we know for all times that you are a thief who has ensured that young Kenyans cannot go to school and we cannot have drugs in hospitals. When we do that, then this country will begin to move in the right direction. I was telling somebody will say, the ESCC does nothing. I said, what do you expect the ESCC? If you are stealing in your backyard, is theft not a sin which is condemned by the Bible? Is it not condemned by the Quran and the Hindu Gita? Why don't you just obey your Christians to wait for ESCC, which has only 200 workers, to police you? So we must have moral rearmament as a people.
Right.
And to contextualize it to this debate, moral rearmament also means that we speak truth at all levels and that we are decent people. Once we have participated in processes and we have not gotten what we wanted through those processes, we must not allow words to destroy. So that even as much as I was praising Raila and the President Ruto, they may be speaking nicely, but why are they not telling their hangers-on to speak nicely?
Indeed.
Yeah.
I mean, for time immemorial, these are some of the things we have insisted on, that conversations like this must take place, that these are the spaces that we must use to send out these messages. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you.
And for sharing.
Thank you for the great work you continue to do.
Asante sana.
Thank you.
This is the